Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This talk is entitled, So What Has the IARU Ever Done for Us? It's being given by Don Beattie, G3BJ, who, as a past president of the RSGB, he is currently the president of the IARU Region 1. Don's going to look at the IARU, what it is and what it does. He's going to describe what they're doing now, how the challenges representing amateur radio globally are changing, and what the world would be like without the IARU. I'd like you all to welcome Don G3BJ.
Well, thanks, Elaine, and good morning, everybody. Right, first show of hands. Who's a member of IARU? No, wrong answer. No, nobody's a member of IARU. You are a member of your National Radio Society, which is a member of IARU, and that's the way it works. What I'm going to do in the next 45 minutes, or less, hopefully, is to describe who we are, how we operate, and some of the challenges we're currently facing, because, believe you me, today the challenges are quite significant. Actually, it's really just, it's not whatever has it ever done for us, it's just about IARU. And I'm covering it in three sections: the radio spectrum today, because it's changing, needless to say, an overview of IARU and its history, and exactly what we do today. I'll try and leave time at the end for questions. I don't think I need to tell you that the radio spectrum is in ever-increasing demand, right? The prices being traded for the upper frequencies are enormous, and there are pressures on lots of users to release spectrum, particularly the government and military, who seem to hoard spectrum in case of a rainy day. We can't afford to buy spectrum, of course, and we're seen as sitting on vast areas of spectrum for which there has been no revenue to the various governments around the world. And the bottom line of this means that the spectrum that we all enjoy today is only acquired and retained through professional level advocacy and a hell of a lot of research. So let's look a little more deeply at that. The ITU is the International Telecommunications Union. It's the United Nations Specialized Agency for Information and Communication Technologies. That's what it is, and it allocates globally radio spectrum. That's one level of allocation. There is a national, or in some cases regional, allocation as well. And it develops the standards to ensure that, as far as possible, we can all communicate without getting in each other's hair. In the past, the spectrum allocation driven by the ITU has been concerning the ITU itself and national regulators. That's people like Ofcom in this country and their equivalent around the world. And the ITU reached its decisions in WRCs through a voting process. So, put simply, if you could get more than 50% of the countries at a World Radio Conference voting in favour of a proposal, then it would get through, most likely. And so you just needed that majority. And in those days, we made a lot of gains, because we did have a lot of friends around the world who were prepared to support a reasonable requests from the amateur service for spectrum. But now the world is different. The regional telecommunications organizations, the RTOs, are becoming much more significant in the allocation of spectrum. The RTO around here, of course, is CEPT, and we all have CEPT licenses under the arrangements for international roaming. Each regional telecommunications organization tries to develop a common position representing the view of its member states, and ITU now works by consensus. This doesn't mean you need 50% plus one. It means you need 100% without one against. So we have to get 100% agreement, or at least non-opposition, to an amateur request for spectrum. And this is a really tough environment. So what we see is 6 regional telecommunications organizations really having the influence. The Asia Pacific Telecommunity, the Arab Spectrum Management Group, the African Telecommunications Union, CPT in Europe, which is a French term, I won't even try to pronounce it today, CTEL in the Americas, and RCC, which is the Commonwealth of Independent States, formerly the parts of the Soviet Union. And those are the 6 RTOs that we in IARU, as I'll explain a little later on, have to relate to. This is a small ASMG meeting. This is one of the smaller meetings that we get involved in. And as you can see, there are probably only 50 people, 60 people in the room. It's a relatively small gathering. ITU is a somewhat different kettle of fish. The way that we achieve agreement today in ITU is proposals start with national administrations putting forward proposals. The regional telecommunications organizations and study groups prepare their respective positions, as do individual nation states. And then it goes to ITU through a group of working parties and ultimately to a World Radio Conference, which is held every 4 years or so. And ITU is a large organization. A World Radio Conference, as I'll show you a little later, is an enormous undertaking. That is a World Radio Conference, casts of thousands, and little old IARU is relatively insignificant numerically in that forum. What we have to do is to make ourselves significant in terms of the leverage we can create. So who else is involved in the spectrum that we enjoy today? I've used the inverted commas regulators because they're not strictly regulators. The standards organizations. ETSI, the European Telecommunications Standard Institute, CENELEC, CISPA, the Global International Special Committee on Radio Interference. They're all aiming at influencing EMC standards to ensure that there is appropriate protection for radio services. At least that's what the small print says. The reality is, in CISPA particularly, which is the global body, that it is heavily dominated by interested equipment manufacturers, so people who make almost anything capable of creating interference for radio services or things that will be subject to CISPA standards, who are fighting very hard, of course, for the most lax of standards. And some of the ones doing the rounds at the moment are particularly worrying, and I'll perhaps refer to some of those in a few minutes. So we have to understand that there is a spectrum allocation issue and there is a spectrum cleanliness issue, both of which we in IARU seek to influence. The standard side involves both the member societies of IARU and ourselves interfacing with the various organizations that actually come together in this cobweb of standards organizations influencing global standards in areas that we are of interest, or are of interest to us. So let's look at the spectrum decisions. There are multiple points of involvement. It's a complex process, both in terms of the spectrum allocation thing and what I've loosely called the EMC thing here. It's resource hungry, it's time consuming, and the critical thing is that we globally need a single voice with a clear message. There is no point going into forums and find that we have a disconnected message from those of us who are there representing IARU, those of us who are there as part of our national delegations representing the interests of amateur radio, and perhaps other bodies that are able to be there and have an interest in amateur radio. So we need to get a high level of coordination and a very clear message into all these forums. So let's look at how IARU operates in spectrum issues. First of all, what is IARU? It's an umbrella organization. It's an umbrella organization of national amateur radio societies. I think we've got 167 amateur radio societies around the world, one in each country. And the world from both an ITU and an IARU point of view is divided into 3 regions, roughly the Americas, Europe, Africa, Middle East and North Asia, and Asia Pacific. And my part is the middle bit, which is Europe, Africa, Middle East and North Asia. We don't have any staff. We're entirely volunteer-based, and our core remit, although we do a bundle of other stuff, is the development of the amateur radio spectrum through discussion, negotiations with ITU and the RTOs, and advocacy for standards to keep the spectrum as far as possible available for use. And of course we work very closely with our member societies in this mission. We were founded in 1925, so we've been around nearly a century now. We first became active not so much as IARU, but as some of the people who were founding IARU in the 27 Washington Radio Telegraph Conference, and you can see that since then we've been admitted to participation in CCIR, which later became part of ITU. It's the radio communications sector of ITU in 32. So we've been around in ITU an awful long time. Then ITU created its 3-region structure, and we progressively formed 3 regions over the subsequent 20 years or so, 20, 30 years. IARU is governed by an administrative council. I hate that word because it sounds awfully paper-pushing, but in fact it isn't. It's just that when the Constitution was written, it was kind of mirroring what ITU was trying to do, and frankly, in my view, it needs to be changed, but that's not for today. Governed by an administrative council, and then the 3 regions have their own executive committees. This is the first IARU Congress, 1925. It's interesting that they had simultaneous translation here. If you can read the blackboards, that's in English and that's in French. And these are some of the names that were there at the time. Many of you will recognize Jerry Marcuse, who was one of the shakers and movers in the early Empire broadcasting back in the 30s. Obviously Hiram Percy Maxim, W1AW, who founded ARRL. But 23 other countries. So, you know, that's about 26 countries were there. It was a significant number of people coming together in 25. Where are we today? We are, as I said, 167 member societies with 3 regions under this International Secretariat Administrative Council structure. What have we done for you over the last few years? Well, going back post-war, acquisition of the 21 meg band, the creation of satellite service, the 10, 18, 24 meg bands, more satellite bands, improving the 1.8 meg bands, getting the 7 meg extension in Region 1 in 2003, introducing the 136 and 472 kilohertz band globally, a rather disappointing global 5 megahertz band allocation at the last WRC, which wholly reflected the new way that ITU is operating. It was almost impossible to get agreement on that. There were a lot of deeply polarized views there. Improvements in international roaming, both within CEPT and within CTEL. And right now, as many of you will know, we're working on trying to get a radio regulations allocation for 50 megs in Region 1. Today we operate on 50 megs through the auspices of Article 4.4 of the radio regulations, which is essentially a group of national allocations, which can be reversed at a moment's notice. What we want to get, as Region 2 and Region 3 already have, is an allocation in the radio regulations table for 50 megs. And obviously it mainly affects, in fact almost totally affects Region 1. So that's where we are today in some of our track record. Other work, we're a sector member of ITU-D, which is a focus on emergency communications. And we have developed with ITU a range of emergency communications documents, handbooks, manuals, and so on and so forth. And we get a lot of our kudos in ITU through the work we do in Sector D. That is, within these 4 walls, that's one of the key reasons for doing it, which is to raise the street cred of IARU within ITU. And we're also active in the Smart Sustainable Development Model, Spectrum Management Training Program, and some amateur radio administration courses. But they're all to support our mission of spectrum advocacy, justification for amateur spectrum. On EMC, it's a tough environment, but we have been able to get EMC requirements for electronic low voltage LED lights developed. We've developed we've catalyzed the development of new requirements for photovoltaic inverters, the sort of things you hang on the back of solar panels. We've got 505611, which is the normal PLT standard, up to 30 megs. I said which protects the amateur spectrum. One or two people might perhaps disagree with that view, but actually, without that standard, the level of interference from PLT on the amateur bands will be 40 dB higher. So you just need to get that in perspective, really. And frankly, I think for most people, within the amateur bands, not the case outside the amateur bands, but within the amateur bands, PLT now is moderately benign. We have limits for plasma TV, which was being introduced too late, below 30 megs. And we have a set of milestones we're working on to try and prevent spurious emissions from WPT, wireless power transmission systems, which today is probably the most certainly the most significant threat to amateur radio in the residential environment, together with electric vehicles themselves. And what we will see is a battle royal over the next 12 months to see whether there is enough weight of opinion to protect the radio spectrum from the onslaught of WPT. And that is a huge issue because if I can put it in perspective, very roughly your noise level will rise by 40 dBs if we don't win this battle. So we just need to understand what the stakes are here. We've got requirements, protection requirements for amateur radio built into the EMC database of CISPA, or more accurately the IEC. And we're starting a debate in CISPA about multiple source disturbances. Now, I'm not going to go into the technology of that at the moment, but crudely, the more digital devices you have within hearing range, the more they call into question the current CISPA standards because they're all built around a single device. And as soon as you put lots of devices in, a lot of the probability assumptions that go into modeling CISPA limits fall away. And we're arguing from the amateur radio service point of view that this is something that needs to be comprehended in setting new standards. And the first standard, guess what, that may well come under this resetting is WPT. And so there is a significant amount of contention at the moment about whether we've got it right or the industry, who come up with all sorts of semi-credible arguments about, no, it's not really like that, have got it right themselves. So that's a bit of an issue. Who are the people today in IARU? This section, remember, is about IARU more than about technology. Tim Elam is the president of IARU globally. He's a QC, which comes in handy occasionally, and he's based in Calgary. Oleg Arpested, who some of you will know, who was the president of Region 1 a few years back, from Norway, is the vice president, and you'll all know Dave Sumner, K1ZZ, recently retired CEO from ARRL, who's the international secretary. We have three presidents, myself in Region 1, Ray in Region 2, and a new president elected 2-3 weeks ago, takes office today, is Wisnu in Region 3, Asia Pacific. So what we're trying to do in the whole scene of IARU is to stop these regions becoming silos. There's a real historical trend that they've done their own thing, and you remember my comment earlier on about having a single, clear, coordinated voice in ITU and all those places. We're trying to work much more across the world now. That's where we are in terms of our member societies. So we pretty much cover the world. We've got a couple there and a few in the Africa, Middle East area where we don't have member societies today, and out in PNG. But apart from that, we're pretty much can claim to be totally representative of national radio societies around the world. Our funding, because it does cost money to go to meetings in Geneva and all sorts of exciting places. The CISPA meeting, annual meeting, is being held in South Korea this coming week, and we have 2 people going there, so this is not cheap. And what happens is that the fees paid to are paid to regional organisations from their member societies, and typically in Region 1, for example, every licensed member of a member society in Region 1, the relevant national society pays roughly £1.30 to IARU. So that's, of your 40, I can't remember what the RSGB membership fee is today, but it's 40 something pound, upper 40s. £1.30 goes to the IARU cause. And 10% of the income that goes to the regions is passed on to the International Secretariat. So if you like, it's a double hop from the member society at £1.30 to the region, and then from the region, 10% of that income to the IS. The funding is under stress, you'd expect it to be, because we have reduced income from member societies because their numbers are going down, and increased demands. So this is a huge problem for us. And you know, this is an important point. The ARRL today provides significant additional funding for IS, significant additional funding. And without that, IARU would be in very serious problems. In Region 1, 12 societies of the 96, I think we have, 97 we have at the moment, provide 82% of the funding. So that's Germany and that's the United Kingdom. And that's virtually half the top 12, the 82% comes from 2 countries. So that's where we get our income from. We have in Region 1 54 societies in Europe, 35 in Africa officially, and 12 in North Asia. However, a small number are temporarily suspended due to lack of activity and other reasons. In some of these countries, if you fall out with the ruling family, your radio society doesn't exist any longer. So it's a precarious existence in a few countries in certain parts of the region. So that's IARU in a nutshell. Now let me move on to how we actually try to deliver value for you. And this is where it gets a little bit detailed, and I try not to bore you, but let me do it anyway. These are the organizations with whom we have to interface. So this is the map you saw earlier on of the 3 regions. And these are in red, the organizations that we interface with. And you'll see that it's my lot in Region 1 to have the largest group, simply because of the span of our geography. The International Secretariat, the Administrative Council worry about ITU. They take the strategic lead for World Radio Conferences and for CISPA, the Global Standards Organization. Here in Region 1, we also concern ourselves with ITU, of course, but also CEPT, ATU, ASMG, and RCC, the 4 regional telecommunications organizations in Region 1, together with Senelec and ETSI, the 2 European standards organizations. Region 2 and Region 3 have their own, and then the member societies, without whom we cannot operate, relate to their national regulator, their national standards organizations or standards committees, and the regional telecommunications organization in Europe, CEPT. So there's quite a lot of interfacing going on there, and there are 3 ways that we can make progress on your behalf. One is we can acquire new spectrum for amateur radio to use. We tried that in the last WRC, and we ended up with 15 kilohertz at 5 megs. So that's getting quite tough for the reasons I explained earlier. Secondly, we can have a go at spectrum consolidation. And by that I mean rationalizing the allocations across the world. So obvious examples are 1.8, 7, and 50. 7 megs, we're still 100 kilohertz short of what Region 2 has. 1.8 megs, there are all sorts of strange limits about power and frequency and all that sort of thing that, frankly, stem back 40 years or more to the days of Loran. And 50 megs, where I've mentioned it already, we have an issue with trying to harmonize region 1 with the other 2 regions. So spectrum consolidation, and then spectrum retention, keeping what we have today. And I'd like to think that as you go down that list, it gets easier. But some of the things that are happening here in the UHF microwave area are very concerning as the dollar bill signs appear in people's, some regulators' minds, and they understand that 5G needs lots more spectrum, allegedly, and are prepared to sacrifice non-priority users in the interests of progress. So in theory it should get easier, in practice it doesn't really. And then let's talk about how we work, because we're trying to do those 3 things. We have a small group, and the emphasis there is on the word small, of what we call expert consultants. They're all volunteers, and they work together in a globally coordinated way to develop our strategy for each WRC, to try and encourage national regulators through their national member societies to support that strategy, to coordinate our strategies and tactics towards each regional telecommunications organization, and to respond to any inputs that national administrations make in the RTOs and ITU, which may be, in our view, off beam. So we have to camp on the whole documentation process for ITU, CEPT, and all the other RTOs to understand what everybody else is saying and comment accordingly. Our objective is to secure agreement in each regional telecommunications organization before we get to WRC. Because frankly, when you get to WRC, it's just impossible to make a significant impact when you've got a cast of thousands. And so having the RTOs lined up with a clear position before each WRC is really important. And as I've said, WRCs work by consensus, so one administration can be a major problem. Our mantra is think global, act local. We've got to have a global strategy, and then we've got to implement it at nationally, regional telecommunications organization level, and of course at the ITU. How do we coordinate that? AC develops the strategy, we develop a work plan for each RTO, and we prepare papers. Member societies then take those and seek support from their administrations to the proposals. There are then the inevitable series of studies, counter-proposals, different models used, anything to put forward a different argument in these various forums. Hopefully, eventually, we will win through. And in parallel with this, the ITU discussions are continuing, and the idea is to bring it all together at a World Radio Conference. So, diagrammatically, member societies to their national administrations, our team to the RTOs, study groups and plenary, and our team to the ITU and working parties. It's a long process. This is the time investment each year. Well, no, not each year. WRC is every 4 years, roughly. So 4 weeks for that. WP5A is the amateur subset of ITU, 4 weeks each year. Conference preparatory meeting, 2 weeks each WRC cycle, and then this lot in CEPT, 12 plus weeks each year, and then the matching number for the other RTOs. So you get into a huge number of weeks involved in the whole process of spectrum acquisition and retention. Another view of a WRC from the IARU desk. Just a huge thing. And here are some statistics from last WRC. So over 3,000 delegates, 162 countries, 170 is the largest delegation there. The latest finish to a plenary was 6 o'clock in the morning, and it started again at 9 o'clock the same morning. So there are some late night sessions in WRCs. Let's look at CEPT now, our local regional telecommunications organization. I won't bore you with the structure, but there are a number of working groups, subgroups, and so on and so forth. And what I've asterisked here is where we are normally represented and where we are represented when there is a relevant issue. And we would like to cover a little bit more of those green ones with red stars because, frankly, there's too much going on. And here's the time commitment in days per year, ignoring preparation time. This is actually pitching up to the meetings. So 12 days a year plus travel time to an ECC, to the ECCs, 15 to WGFM, and so on and so forth. You can see how it mounts up. Quite a lot of time. And this is one of the smaller meetings. This is SE24, which is a specialist subgroup of WGSE. Key agenda items for us at WRC 19 are, as I've already mentioned, the 50 meg allocation, non-geostationary orbit satellites, trackside communications, railway trackside communications, spectrum for international mobile telecommunications, and you can see that bridges some of our bands. 275 to 450 gigahertz mobile and fixed services, radio lands at 5 gigs, and wireless power transfer, and the spectrum to be used for wireless power transfer. I'll just take two of these, just very quickly. 50 megs. We've created a case for why we need more spectrum. We've got some support and a conditional draft ECP, that's a European Common Proposal, finally. We've got concerns from some countries about sharing with residual band 1 television, which frankly shouldn't be a problem, although it is at the moment, but it's getting better. Mobile services, which is a major problem at the moment, and wind profiler radars, which have camped on some parts of 50 megs. We've conducted sharing studies using all sorts of mathematical models, and we've got disagreements about the methodology. We're developing protection criteria, and there is absolutely no guarantee of a successful outcome, despite I don't know how many hundreds of hours that have gone into this so far. So this is a big shove to try and get this sorted out. Wireless power transmission, I referred to earlier on, I'll pick as the other one. This was kicked off at WRC 15 by people saying, hey, we've got to decide what we do with this thing. And work's been going on in ITU, CEPT, CISPA, and ETSI. And ITU is trying to bring all the discussions to a common position. The commercial pressures, of course, are enormous, particularly from Germany and from Asia, the car manufacturing countries of the world. The regulators are less than supportive to the radio users. The military are silent, despite the fact that I spent a lot of time at the NATO Joint Military Civil Committee meeting, meeting in November last year, explaining to them some of the issues they might be facing. The only voices really are the EBU, European Broadcasting Union, BBC, IARU, and the equivalent of the EBU in the US, was it NABA, N-A-B-A. And I firmly believe that WPT is the biggest threat to amateur radio for years and years. And if you look at, there's something on my, I think has been circulated to national societies showing the IARU study on this, and perhaps we might put it on the IARU website actually, now it's gone public, showing how serious a threat it is. So moving towards the end then, this is where we get to the commercial. A small number of experts in IARU currently carry the workload, and we're all getting older. The time demands are increasing, and we need more people with the right skills to help us. We need to find more funding as well, and the simple way of finding more funding is to encourage everybody to join their national society, because that immediately ripples up into IARU income through the levy. And if you think you can help in any form of consultancy capacity, or might even possibly be able to help, please have a word with me or drop me an email. So if you've got spectrum management or any international standards experience, or, you don't need all of these, if you've had experience of working with regulators, or if you can learn those skills quickly, if you're half technical, you can do that pretty quickly, And if you have the commitment to help take amateur radio forward, please, please, we need more resource. We desperately need more resource. So I thought I'd finish off with just a quick slide about the future of amateur radio. We all know about EMC issues in the suburban environment. They're getting worse and worse over the years. WPT is going to be a real humdinger on top of that. You know, everything else will fade into insignificance once WPT gets rolled out. We've got a declining number of amateur radio licenses in some countries. We've got increasing pressure on the spectrum. And that has resulted in an interesting side effect on the 50 meg discussions, in that one regulator decided early on he was going to do a spectrum activity study, very professionally, of the 50 meg band. And he put SDRs all around the country, computer linked to a central database, and recorded activity on 50 megs. And the next meeting, he turns out, he says, you don't need 4 megs, you don't need 2 megs. Our figure is 1.8, I think he came up with. And we said, oh, well, you know, there wasn't any sporadic E at that time, there wasn't any this, there wasn't... No, he said, come on, that's generous. So we've got pushback from regulators now really doing their homework. So a lot of commercial pressures. It's a lot more of a complex process. I believe there's insufficient effort to attract new entrants into amateur radio. And it really means that the amateur radio voice will be, if we're not very careful, less prominent in these key forums in the future. And that's going to be a real downer for us. And from IARU point of view, and I think from the amateur radio movement generally, we've got to ensure we've got the financial resources and the skills to properly represent amateur radio in these forums, because they're the only forums that make these decisions. So for me, the imperatives are programs to attract new people, strong member societies, not fragmentation. In Europe, we're seeing a little bit of a fragmentation with an outfit called EUREO, European Radio Amateurs Organization, nibbling up little local clubs in some countries and causing some noise in the system. We don't need that. We need a strong member society in each country, leading to a strong and unified global voice, and we need professional skills representing our case. And it really is the time for a single-minded commitment, I think, to take amateur radio forward. That's all I want to say. If you want to look for more information, there are 2 websites. One's the corporate IARU website, and the other one's the Region 1 website. If you want to talk to me, that's where you can find me. We've got 7 minutes, so let me just see whether there are any questions.